You know, this series of Lent is all about breaking down these walls, these expectations that we have for ourselves. It's about growing. It's about redefining this idea that we have to be healed in order to grow, that we have to have it all together in order to actually bear fruit. And this Lent is special. It's about diving into the dark on purpose and with purpose, that we might grow and evolve, that we might heal our relationships ultimately with ourselves and then our relationship with God. And as we journey into that dark, we do so with the full understanding that only good things grow in the dark. You know, the dark is a funny place. It's a really funny place in many ways. But it's a funny place to think that we might find God. But in a lot of ways, it's the only place that we find God. In a quiet surrender that doesn't rely on our own limited understanding or our own flawed perception of the world. Those dark corners in our spirits, they create an environment that demands vulnerability, that demands accountability. And in that environment, the real us is the only person that's allowed to show up. And there's no calling in sick. There's no flexible holidays. There's just us, our deepest fears and insecurities, and God. And friends, I think Paul understood that place. I think he knew it well, maybe better than anyone ever has. And that perspective influences the way that he calls us, each and every one of us, out into the light. And our scripture today is Paul's explanation of that in this first letter to the Corinthians. And it says, the message that points to Christ on the cross, it seems like sheer silliness to those hell-bent on destruction. But to those of us on the way to salvation, it makes perfect sense. This is the way that God works, and most powerfully, as it turns out. It's written, I'll turn conventional wisdom on its head. I'll expose so-called experts as shams. So where can you find someone truly wise, truly educated, truly intelligent in this day and age? Hasn't God exposed it all as pretentious nonsense? Since the world and all of its fancy wisdom never had a clue when it came to knowing God, God in his wisdom took delight in knowing what the world considered stupid, preaching of all things, to bring those who trust him into the way of salvation. And while Jews clamor for miraculous demonstrations and Greeks go in for philosophical wisdom, we go right on proclaiming Christ the crucified. And Jews treat this like an anti-miracle, and Greeks just pass it off as absurd. But to those of us who are personally called by God himself, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is God's ultimate miracle. And wisdom, all wrapped up in one. Human wisdom is so cheap, so impotent, next to the seemingly absurdity of God. Human strength can't begin to compete with God's weakness. So I want you to think for a moment here, just a moment, about Paul's argument. You know, it can be said that this particular passage, and also all throughout Paul's writing, he's making a particular point. And what is he using as the selling point of God? Well, friends, time and time again, he's using the cross, and he's using crucifixion as a reason to believe in God, that the cross might be our glory. And it makes sense to us a little bit now, but we have to recognize that at the time that Paul was living, and to a lesser degree even now, that's a terrible marketing strategy. It's not a good one. Of all the things to be preaching about the cross and crucifixion, well, it just was pretty dumb. And the cross was this capital punishment. It was a tool used by the Romans, and with it came a shame that we can't even begin to understand. And for the people of that time, and even for us, there's no glory in that. There's no glory in shame. And as Paul writes, the Jews, they're looking to encounter God in this divine way, in miraculous, ways, to see these signs of a divine presence, to see signs of the greatness of God. And to those Jews, there was no miracle in the cross, and there was certainly no God in crucifixion. And just as Paul writes, the Gentiles, they were looking for God in knowledge and in wisdom, to see a rational demonstration of the glory of God, to see how God could increase their lives. And to them, there was no logic in the cross, and there was no wisdom in crucifixion. And my friends, I'm not sure that as we sit here today, we have much different minds than the Jews and the Gentiles. I'm not so sure that we're searching for God in ways that aren't limited to our own short-sighted perspective. And I'm not so sure that we're not seeking for God to show up in ways that are far less foolish than what we find. And there's a part of me that's convinced that we expect to find God in the daylight. That we expect that we're just going to walk out in the light and we're just going to see God around the corner. What's up? In some miraculous way, in some divine wisdom. But the God we seek is not the God that we find. The truth is that God looms in the dark corners, in those shadows. And God waits for us to take a step within. And Paul continues writing in this passage of 1 Corinthians. He says, take a look, friends, at who you were when you were called into this life. I don't see many of the brightest and best among you. Not many influential. Not many from high society families. Isn't it obvious that God deliberately chose men and women that the culture overlooks and exploits and abuses? Chose these nobodies to expose the hollow pretensions of the somebodies. That makes it quite clear that none of you can get by blowing your own horn before God. Everything that we have, right thinking and right living, a clean slate and a fresh start, comes from God by way of Jesus Christ. And that's why we have the saying, if you're going to blow a horn, blow a trumpet for God. When did we lose the thread? When did we forget how we got into this thing in the first place? When did we become everything we used to hate? You know, somewhere along the line, we begin to let our religion enter the room before our faith. Somewhere along the line, we begin to let our desire for miracles outshine the miracles that are happening right in front of us. And somewhere along that line, we let our search for wisdom blind us to the knowledge that's standing right before us. My friends, we didn't find God. God found us. I need you to know that. I need you to hear it. I need you to fully embrace it, that God found you. And God didn't only find you in the sunlight. God found you in the dark, in the healing place, in that place of forgiveness, in that place of rebirth. And Paul reminds us that the cross is glory, not shame, not embarrassment, but pure, unadulterated glory. But how shall we encounter a God that humbles himself in such a way? My friends, the only thing standing between you and God is you. It's your pride. It's your foolishness. It's your desire to keep it all together. And in order to change our lives, in order to change our relationship with ourselves and ultimately our relationship with God, we have to be willing to be changed, to strip away our need to be so buttoned up, to stop letting our egos drive the ship, to be humble in body and in spirit. And that requires us to relinquish some control, to stop affirming ourselves so much, and to trust that God's got us in both moments of joy, but also in moments of turmoil. To trust that God has found us, and God can and will find us again. But only if we're willing to go the distance, only if we're willing to do the work, to journey into the dark. So the question before you today is, are you willing to get out of your own way? From Psalm 139, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Thanks be to God.
These are your thoughts, Tatum. This is the hope of God set free. These are your talks, it's